He becomes forgetful and thus ungrateful for all that God had done, the actual salvation of God. So friends, let's think about this for a second. Gratitude is a necessary virtue for the Christian. In fact, it is a necessary virtue for the health and strength of any human soul. Genuine thankfulness, genuine gratitude, the habit of being thankful for all that God has done is a powerful antidote. Anger and pain and frustration and division and bitterness. It is a powerful thing God has built within us. So thankfulness to God is a constant refrain for the writers of Scripture to remember what God has done and to respond in gladness, to respond in worship. There are these kinds of songs and passages throughout the Old Testament and sections in the New. But then as you read the book of Psalms and you read it through the lens of gratitude and thanksgiving, you just see it over and over and over. There's this great passage in the book of Hebrews where the writer of Hebrews is recalling Mount Sinai, this incredible story in the middle of the book of Exodus where God comes down and sets foot on a mountain, gives Moses the 10 commandments and the law. All of that's coming in Exodus 19 and 20. And as the writer of Hebrews is reflecting on what God has given there on Mount Sinai, the writer says this in chapter 12, verses 28 and 29. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus, as a result of remembering and being grateful for the kingdom God has given, let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. God shows up on the top of Mount Sinai as fire. So let us be grateful for what God has given us in the past. And as a result, let us worship God for what he has done. So Pharaoh's forgetfulness is a big deal. His ingratitude changes his perception of the God of Joseph and the people of Israel, and it changes his perception of the people themselves. And it's a radical move. You go back and you read the story of Joseph and the Pharaoh that knew Joseph, the Pharaoh that brought Joseph into second place, so to speak, in the book of, in the nation of Egypt. He says this of Joseph in Genesis chapter 41. That Pharaoh said, "Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?" The Pharaoh that knew Joseph recognized the divine hand that was on him. The Pharaoh that forgot Joseph turned against the people of God. So friends, this is a critical lesson in this passage. As we understand what happens, and as you and I try to make sense even of our relationship with God in our particular context right now. Listen to this. Gratitude connects our present to our past. It connects our present to the past in good ways. Our past, our personal past, our collective past may be imperfect, but gratitude helps us see the goodness of God when and where it happens. It helps us frame our present with the goodness and the power of God. And it helps us anticipate the future through the lens of the goodness and the greatness of God. There are a few Psalms that recall the story of the book of Exodus. And they're interesting Psalms, especially Psalm 136, because it gets very repetitive. I'd encourage you to go and read Psalm 136 inside of this context, because the psalmist will write one line about the greatness of God, and then the next line is the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, line after line after line after line. And most of that psalm is recalling the story of the book of Exodus. You see, the psalmist says, we're going to remember and we're going to pull the goodness and the power of God into our lives now. And we're going to teach ourselves that the God who did those kinds of things is the God who rules us now and the God who rules our future. So forgetfulness robs us of God's goodness in the past. And what happens when we do that is a vacuum is created in the present. When we forget God, there's this vacuum that's created, this vacuum of understanding and meaning and purpose and direction. And what happens is that vacuum gets filled with fear and anxiety and even anger and hatred. This is what forgetfulness does. It corrodes both our present and our future. I think this is so important for us because, friends, right now there is a powerful cultural trend among us that is actually dedicated to forgetting our past and to destroying our past. The vision is it's all bad, and it has to be forgotten. It has to be left in the past, and we're going to rebuild a brand new utopia on humanistic principles. And friends, let me tell you, if you don't study history, every time a group of powerful human beings say it's time to rebuild utopia, the first thing that happens is blood is shed. It's just bad news. Forgetfulness has devastating consequences. The author Os Guinness, an author, a Christian speaker, writes a lot of fascinating books. One that he wrote just a couple of years ago is called The Magna Carta of Humanity. And I was thinking of this passage of Scripture this week as I was going through Exodus chapter 1. Here's part of what Os Guinness says about this issue. The danger for society is that when young people are allowed to learn only the negative lessons from history to justify the victim narrative, they end in reinforcing the evils from their past rather than remedying them. They have been trained to use the injuries of the past to serve the interests of their future and thus to ignore the real responsibilities of the present. You need to chew on that for a little while. Forgetfulness has devastating consequences. It separates us from our present. It creates an evil future for us. So what happens in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 is a really big deal.